A tale of werewolves, alphas, and fated destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The blizzard came without warning, which Celine supposed was fitting given that most terrible things in her life had arrived exactly the same way, unexpected and devastating, and leaving destruction in their wake that could never quite be repaired, no matter how much time passed, or how much distance she put between herself and the wreckage. She'd been sitting by her small fireplace in the cottage that had been her prison and sanctuary for the past 8 years, stirring a pot of rabbit stew that would have to last her at least 3 more days if she rationed it properly, when the wind suddenly changed from a gentle whisper through the pine trees to a howling shriek that made the wooden walls of her tiny home shudder and groan like they might simply give up and collapse under the assault. The temperature dropped so fast that Celine could actually feel the cold seeping through the cracks in the walls, turning her breath into visible clouds, even though the fire was burning strong and hot just 3 feet away from where she sat on her rough wooden stool. The only piece of furniture she owned besides the narrow bed in the corner and the table she'd built herself from fallen timber during her first winter alone in these woods. She set down her wooden spoon carefully, her movements precise and measured the way everything she did was precise and measured. Because when you couldn't see the world around you, when you deliberately blinded yourself to prevent the destruction you could cause with a single unguarded glance, precision and measurement were the only things standing between survival and death in the wilderness. The blindfold she wore was made from soft deer hide, carefully tanned and treated until it was supple enough not to chafe the delicate skin around her eyes, but thick enough that not even the brightest sunlight could penetrate through to her vision. And she'd worn it every single day for 8 years without ever once being tempted to remove it, because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate, too dangerous to risk, too devastating to survive if she made even one mistake. Celine had learned to navigate her small world through sound and scent and touch, through the way the floorboards creaked under her feet in different patterns that told her exactly where she was in the room, through the way the air moved and carried smells that informed her about everything from weather changes to nearby animals to the ripeness of the berries growing in the small garden she tended during the brief summer months. Her hearing had become so acute that she could identify individual birds by their calls from over 100 yards away, could tell the difference between a rabbit's heartbeat and a fox's from 30 feet, could sense another living being's presence long before most wolves would have noticed anything amiss, and it was that heightened hearing that first alerted her to the fact that something was desperately wrong outside her cottage as the blizzard reached its full fury. The sound came through the screaming wind like a knife cutting through silk, sharp and distinct and impossible to ignore, even though every survival instinct Celine possessed was telling her to stay inside, to keep the door barred, to protect herself first, because she'd learned through brutal experience that trying to help others only led to more pain and more guilt and more memories that haunted her in the dark hours before dawn when sleep refused to come and the past refused to stay buried. But the sound came again, weaker this time, and Celine's healer's heart, that stubborn part of her that 8 years of isolation hadn't managed to kill, recognized it for what it was even before her conscious mind could process the information fully enough to form coherent thoughts about what she was hearing and what it might mean and what kind of danger she might be inviting into her carefully controlled existence. Bodies were collapsing in the snow just outside her door. Heavy bodies hitting the frozen ground with thuds she could feel through the floorboards, and the heartbeats she could hear were growing fainter with each passing second, slowing down in that distinctive way that meant hypothermia was setting in fast, and death would follow close behind if someone didn't intervene. Celine stood frozen by her fire, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her breathing coming faster and harder as panic warred with compassion and self-preservation battled against the fundamental truth of who she was at her core, which was someone who had caused so much death and destruction through her cursed gift that the thought of allowing even more death to happen on her doorstep, when she had the power to prevent it, felt like it might finally break whatever fragile pieces of her soul had survived the last 8 years of exile and loneliness and crushing guilt. She counted the heartbeats because counting helped her focus, helped her think clearly when emotions threatened to overwhelm her capacity for rational thought. And what she counted made her breath catch in her throat and her own heart start racing with a fear that was both primal and specific to her particular circumstances. 13 heartbeats, all of them strong and slow in the way that meant these weren't ordinary wolves, but shifters. Warriors, probably, given the sheer size she could sense even through the walls and the storm. And 13 warriors collapsing outside the home of a woman they didn't know could only mean they were either fleeing something terrible or had been caught in the blizzard unprepared. And either way, they were dying, and she was the only one who could help them. And helping them meant opening her door and allowing strangers into her space, and risking everything she'd built over 8 years of careful isolation. The decision made itself really because despite everything Celine had done, and everything that had been done to her, and every reason she had to simply let nature take its course and keep herself safe behind her barred door, she couldn't listen to those heartbeats fade away and do nothing. Couldn't live with herself if she added 13 more deaths to the tally of lives she'd destroyed. Even if these deaths would be through inaction rather than through the terrible power that lived behind her blindfolded eyes. She moved toward the door with quick, sure steps, her feet knowing every inch of the worn path across her floor. And when her fingers closed around the wooden bar that kept her door sealed against the outside world, she allowed herself one moment of hesitation, one brief second where she acknowledged that she was probably making a terrible mistake, and that inviting 13 unknown shifters into her home could very well be the thing that finally got her killed after 8 years of surviving alone. The door fought her when she tried to open it, the wind pushing back with such force that she had to brace her feet and use her full body weight to lever it inward. And the moment there was enough space for the storm to enter, snow and ice and freezing air blasted into her cottage with such violence that she was knocked backward 3 steps and nearly lost her grip on the door entirely. The cold was like nothing she'd experienced before, sharp enough to steal the breath from her lungs and make her exposed skin burn with immediate pain. And through it all, she could hear those heartbeats growing weaker and more erratic, could hear the labored breathing of creatures fighting to stay alive against impossible odds, could sense the massive bodies lying just beyond her threshold in snow that was already deep enough to bury them completely if she didn't act fast. Celine had never considered herself particularly strong, had always been small and slight, even by Omega standards, her frame delicate enough that pack members used to joke she might blow away in a strong wind. But desperation and determination gave her strength she didn't know she possessed as she stepped out into the blizzard and felt her way toward the first body. Her hands found fur, thick and coarse and matted with ice, covering muscles that felt like iron even in their weakened state, and she grabbed hold of the massive wolf's front legs and started pulling, dragging its dead weight toward her door with every ounce of strength she could summon, her feet slipping in the snow and her muscles screaming in protest, but her will absolutely refusing to give up or give in or let this creature die when she had the power to save it. It took her over an hour to get all 13 wolves inside her cottage, and by the time she dragged the last one over her threshold and managed to wrestle the door closed against the storm, she was shaking with exhaustion and cold. Her hands were bleeding from where ice had cut into her palms. Her clothes were soaked through and freezing against her skin, and her small cottage that had always felt spacious enough for one person living alone suddenly felt impossibly cramped, with 13 enormous wolves taking up every available inch of floor space. She could hear them breathing all around her, some steady and strong, others labored and concerning, and she could smell blood sharp and metallic, mixing with the scent of wet fur and the herbs she kept hanging from her rafters. And underneath it all was something else. Something that made her wolf stir restlessly inside her for the first time in years. Something that whispered of power and dominance and an alpha presence so strong it was almost overwhelming even in its weakened state. Celine didn't have time to analyze what that meant, or why one of these wolves in particular made her heart race faster and her breath come shorter and her skin prickle with awareness, because she had injured wolves to assess and treat, and her healer's training, the gift her grandmother had nurtured before everything fell apart, kicked in with an intensity that pushed aside fear and confusion and left only purpose and determination. She moved through her cottage with practiced ease, despite the obstacles now filling her space, her hands reaching out to touch each wolf in turn, her heightened senses cataloging injuries and illnesses with the kind of detail that would have impressed the pack healers who'd trained her if they could have seen her work. If they hadn't cast her out 8 years ago and forbidden her from ever returning or using her gifts among civilized wolves ever again. 3 of the wolves were showing dangerous signs of hypothermia, their body temperatures far too low and dropping, their heartbeats sluggish, their breathing shallow, and she prioritized them first, building up her fire until the small cottage was almost unbearably hot, and then wrapping them in every blanket and piece of cloth she owned, even the curtains she'd made from old clothes, even the spare clothing she kept for the rare occasions when her current garments wore through completely. One wolf had a deep gash across his ribs that was still bleeding freely, the wound serious enough that infection would almost certainly set in if she didn't clean and close it immediately, and she set about treating it with steady hands and complete focus, cleaning away the blood and dirt with water she'd warmed over the fire, stitching the wound closed with the same needle and thread she used to repair her clothes. Her fingers working by touch alone with a precision that 8 years of blindfolded living had taught her, applying a poultice made from herbs she'd gathered and dried during the summer months when the forest was generous with its medicines. The largest wolf, the one whose presence made her skin tingle and her wolf press forward with interest, was the most severely injured, and Celine saved him for last because she knew instinctively that treating him would require her full attention and whatever energy she had left after caring for the others. When her hands finally settled on his massive body, when her fingers traced the contours of muscles that spoke of power and training and a life spent in combat or leadership or both, she felt something shift inside her chest. Something that had been locked away and frozen for 8 years, suddenly warming and stirring and trying to wake from its long hibernation. But she pushed the feeling aside and focused on the injuries she could sense beneath her exploring fingers. The wound across his ribs was deep but clean, the kind of injury that came from claws rather than teeth, from a fight that had been serious but not necessarily to the death, and as she worked to clean and treat it, as her hands moved over his fur with gentle efficiency, she found herself talking to him the way she always talked to herself when she was working, her voice soft and steady and meant to soothe as much as to help her focus her thoughts. "You're going to be fine, big one," she heard herself saying, her words half swallowed by the howling wind outside, but clear enough in the warmth of her cottage. "The wound looks worse than it is, and you're strong enough to survive this easily if you just hold on and let me help you. If you just trust that I know what I'm doing, even though I can't see you. Even though I'm just a strange, blindfolded woman who probably seems completely insane to you right now, if you're even conscious enough to have opinions about your current situation." The wolf made a soft sound, almost like a whine, but deeper, more resonant. And Celine felt his massive head shift under her hand, felt the way he seemed to lean into her touch rather than away from it. And something about that simple gesture of trust from this powerful creature, who should have been wary of her, who should have been suspicious of a lone Omega living in isolation in the forgotten woods, made her throat tight with emotions she'd thought were long dead and buried beneath 8 years of careful numbness. She finished treating his wound in silence, wrapping it with strips of cloth torn from her only spare shirt. And then she sat back on her heels and allowed herself to acknowledge just how exhausted she was, how her muscles were trembling from exertion and cold and the aftermath of adrenaline, how her hands were shaking and her breath was coming in short gasps, and she needed to rest before she collapsed. But even as exhaustion pulled at her, even as her body begged for sleep and her mind felt foggy with fatigue, Celine couldn't quite bring herself to move away from the largest wolf, couldn't quite ignore the way her hand had somehow found its way back to his fur, stroking the thick silver coat that was so similar in color to her own hair that it felt like some kind of sign or connection or cosmic joke she didn't have the energy to decipher. She should have been afraid, should have been terrified actually, because she just locked herself in a small space with 13 massive shifters who could kill her without effort if they chose to, who might wake up angry or suspicious or territorial, who might demand answers she couldn't give or make requests she couldn't fulfill, or simply decide that a lone Omega with a dangerous gift was better off dead than allowed to live in isolation where she might pose a threat to someone someday. But sitting there in her overheated cottage, with her hand resting on silver fur, and 13 heartbeats surrounding her like a symphony of life she'd helped preserve, Celine felt something she hadn't experienced in 8 long years of solitude and self-imposed blindness and crushing loneliness that had become so familiar. She'd almost forgotten there were other ways to feel. She felt needed, useful, like she had a purpose beyond simply surviving from one day to the next. And even though she knew that feeling was dangerous, knew that letting herself care about these strangers would only lead to more pain when they inevitably left or rejected her, or discovered what she really was and recoiled in horror, she couldn't quite make herself pull away, couldn't quite force herself to retreat back into the safe numbness that had protected her for so long. The fire crackled and popped. The wind howled outside her walls. The 13 wolves breathed steadily around her in various states of sleep and unconsciousness, and Celine allowed herself to close her eyes behind her blindfold and rest her head against the side of the largest wolf, just for a moment, just until she caught her breath and gathered enough strength to prepare more medicine and check on the hypothermia cases and make sure everyone was stable enough to survive the night. But exhaustion claimed her faster than she expected, pulling her down into sleep with a suddenness that would have alarmed her if she'd been conscious enough to notice, and the last thing she was aware of before darkness took her was the feeling of warm fur beneath her cheek and the steady, strong heartbeat of the silver wolf keeping rhythm with her own, like a promise or a prophecy or the beginning of something that would change absolutely everything about the carefully controlled life she'd built in isolation. Though she had no way of knowing that yet, no way of understanding that the 13 wolves she'd saved were about to save her right back in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. Celine woke to the sound of breathing that wasn't her own. 13 distinct patterns of inhale and exhale that surrounded her like a living cocoon. And for a moment, in that space between sleep and consciousness, she couldn't remember where she was or why her small cottage felt so crowded and warm and full of presences that shouldn't have been there. And then the memories came rushing back with enough force to make her gasp and sit up so quickly that her head spun with the sudden movement. The wolves were still there, all 13 of them, taking up every available space in her tiny home, and the blizzard was still raging outside, though the wind had lost some of its earlier fury, settling into a steady howl that promised the storm would last at least another full day, and possibly longer, which meant she was trapped in this small space with 13 massive shifters who would eventually wake up and demand answers, and possibly recognition, and definitely explanations. She wasn't sure she could provide without revealing the truth about what she was, and why she lived alone, and why she wore a blindfold, even though her eyes were perfectly functional beneath the soft leather that kept them hidden from the world. Her hand was still resting on the silver wolf's side, she realized with a start. Her fingers buried in thick fur that was warmer now than it had been last night, and she could feel the steady rise and fall of his breathing and the strong beat of his heart, and something about the intimacy of that contact made her pull away quickly, made her scramble backward until her spine hit the wall and she could put some distance between herself and the creature who made her wolf stir restlessly inside her with interest and awareness and something that felt dangerously close to recognition. She took a deep breath and tried to calm the racing of her own heart, tried to remind herself that these were just wolves who had needed help and that she had provided that help, and that when the storm cleared, they would leave and she would go back to her solitary existence and everything would return to the carefully maintained normal she'd built over 8 years of isolation. But even as she thought it, she knew it was a lie, knew that something had shifted in the night while she slept with her head against silver fur, knew that whatever happened next would change things in ways she couldn't predict or control or prevent, no matter how much she might want to. She spent the morning moving carefully around her cottage, checking on each wolf in turn, changing bandages on the injured one, monitoring the breathing of the 3 who'd been hypothermic to make sure their body temperatures had stabilized, preparing more medicine from her dwindling supply of herbs because she hadn't anticipated needing to treat 13 massive warriors, and her stores were meant for one small Omega who rarely got sick or injured in her careful, isolated life. The wolves didn't stir as she worked, their exhaustion so complete that even her touch barely registered in their sleeping minds, and she found herself grateful for their continued unconsciousness, because it meant she didn't have to face them yet, didn't have to see their reactions when they realized who and what had saved them, didn't have to watch the inevitable moment when gratitude turned to suspicion or fear or disgust the way it always did when people learned the truth about her gift. But as the day wore on and the storm continued its assault on her small sanctuary, as the wolves began to stir and shift in their sleep with increasing restlessness that suggested consciousness was returning, whether she was ready for it or not, Celine found her anxiety building to almost unbearable levels, her breath coming faster and her hands shaking as she tried to prepare herself for the confrontation that was coming. She had started talking to them again without really meaning to, her voice filling the silence the way it always did when she was alone, and needed to hear human speech just to remember what it sounded like. Needed to process her thoughts out loud, because keeping everything locked inside her head made the loneliness worse somehow. Made the isolation feel more complete and suffocating and permanent than it already was after 8 years of having no one to talk to except herself and the occasional bird or rabbit who wandered too close to her cottage. "You're probably going to be angry when you wake up," she heard herself saying as she stirred the pot of stew she'd stretched to feed 14 instead of 1 by adding more water and some of the dried venison she'd been saving for emergencies. "Angry that a stranger touched you while you were unconscious? Angry that you're trapped here by the storm? Angry that you had to be rescued by someone like me? Someone broken and cursed and living in exile because she's too dangerous to be around normal wolves who haven't learned to fear their own reflection." Her voice caught on the last words, the old pain rising up to choke her the way it always did when she thought too long about what she'd lost, about the family she'd destroyed through no fault except being born with a gift that was more curse than blessing, about the brother who didn't remember having a sister, and the mother who looked at her like a stranger, and the father who'd tried to use her as a weapon until she ran away into the wilderness rather than become the monster he wanted her to be. "I didn't mean to take her memories," Celine whispered, and she wasn't even sure which wolf she was talking to anymore. Wasn't sure if she was confessing to the silver one who made her heart race, or to all of them collectively, or to herself, because after 8 years of silence, the words just needed to come out, needed to be spoken, even if no one was conscious enough to hear them or understand them or judge her for the terrible truth they contained. "I was 7 years old, and we were arguing about something stupid, something I can't even remember now, which is ironic, given what happened next. And she grabbed my arm too hard, and it hurt, and I was angry, and I looked at her, really looked at her with all that childish rage and hurt, and I felt something flow out of me into her through our locked eyes, felt something fundamental and important leave her and disappear into nothing. And when she finally let go and stepped back, she looked at me like she'd never seen me before in her entire life. The memory was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday instead of 17 years ago. The look on her mother's face burned into Celine's mind with the kind of clarity that trauma etches into memory, making it impossible to forget, no matter how much time passes or how much distance you put between yourself and the event. "She asked my father who I was," Celine continued, her voice breaking now, tears she couldn't see because of the blindfold, but could feel sliding down her cheeks, hot and shameful, and proof that 8 years alone hadn't been enough to heal the wounds she'd inflicted on herself and everyone around her. "Asked him why there was a strange child in their house, asked him if I was someone's daughter who needed help, and my father just stared at me with this expression of absolute horror, like he'd just realized his daughter was a monster, like he'd just understood that everything he thought he knew about me was wrong and dangerous and needed to be contained or destroyed before I hurt someone else. She had tried for years after that to fix it, had stared into her mother's eyes every single day, trying to give back what she'd taken, trying to reverse the damage, trying to make her mother remember that she had a daughter who loved her and needed her and was desperately sorry for whatever terrible thing she'd done. But nothing worked, nothing changed, and eventually her mother moved away to live with distant relatives because living in a house with a stranger's child was too uncomfortable and confusing and wrong. Her father had kept Celine, had seen the potential in her gift for something other than accidental destruction, had started bringing her people whose memories he wanted erased, enemies and rivals, and anyone who knew too much about his business dealings. And Celine had refused at first, had fought against becoming the weapon he wanted her to be. But her father had been persuasive in the way that powerful wolves could be persuasive, with violence and threats, and the kind of manipulation that made a child believe she owed him obedience and compliance, and the use of her terrible gift to pay for the sin of existing. I erased 17 people's memories before I was 15, Celine said, her voice flat now, emotionless, because feeling too much when she talked about this part of her past made it impossible to breathe, made it impossible to function, made her want to do something drastic and permanent that would end the guilt and the shame and the weight of all those stolen lives pressing down on her shoulders every single day. 17 people who woke up not knowing who they were, or where they came from, or what their names had been, before I looked at them and took everything that made them themselves, and my father told me it was necessary, told me they were bad people who deserved to forget, told me I was helping him protect our pack from threats and dangers I was too young to understand. And I believed him because what else could I do? Because he was my father, and surely fathers didn't lie to their daughters about things that important. The truth had come out when Celine was 15 and her younger brother Caden, who was 12 and had always been her closest friend and ally in a household that felt increasingly dangerous and wrong, had discovered what their father was making her do. Caden had been furious, had confronted their father with the kind of righteous anger that only children who haven't yet learned to be afraid of powerful people can muster. And their father had struck him hard enough to break his jaw, and Celine had reacted without thinking, had grabbed her father's arm and looked at him with every ounce of rage and hurt and betrayal she possessed, intending to make him forget everything, intending to erase him the way he'd made her erase so many others. But Caden had gotten between them, had pushed Celine away, trying to protect her from their father's retaliation. And in the chaos and confusion and terror of that moment, Celine's power had lashed out wildly, uncontrolled, and when the dust settled and the screaming stopped, Caden was standing there looking at her with absolutely no recognition in his eyes, looking at her the same way their mother had looked at her 8 years earlier, like she was a stranger, a threat, someone to be feared and avoided and definitely not loved. "He didn't remember me at all," Celine said, and her voice was so quiet now that she could barely hear it herself, over the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind and the breathing of 13 wolves who were probably hearing every word she said if they were conscious enough to process sound into meaning. But she couldn't stop now, couldn't hold back the confession that had been building inside her for 8 years, with nowhere to go and no one to hear it, and no possibility of absolution or forgiveness or even basic understanding. He didn't remember our childhood together, didn't remember the games we'd played or the secrets we'd shared or the promises we'd made to always protect each other, didn't remember that he had a sister at all. And when I tried to explain, when I tried to tell him who I was and what I'd done and how sorry I was, he just looked at me with fear and confusion and told me to get away from him, told me I was scaring him, told me he wanted his father to make the strange, crying girl leave him alone. The pack had banished her that same night, had given her a bag of supplies, and pointed her toward the border, and told her if she ever came back, they would execute her as a threat to pack security. And Celine had walked into the wilderness with nothing but guilt and grief and the absolute certainty that she deserved every terrible thing that would happen to her from that moment forward, that she deserved to die alone and unmourned and forgotten, because that's what happened to monsters who destroyed their own families through powers they couldn't control. She'd found this cottage 3 weeks into her exile, had stumbled across it more dead than alive from exposure and starvation, and the kind of despair that made continuing to breathe feel like more punishment than mercy. And she'd decided to stay, decided to blind herself so she could never hurt anyone ever again. decided to live in isolation where her curse couldn't reach anyone else, and where she could at least pretend she was protecting the world from herself, instead of just hiding from the consequences of her existence. "So you see," Celine said, directing her words toward the silver wolf, who still hadn't stirred, but whose heartbeat she could hear strong and steady across the small space of her cottage. "I'm not a good person. I'm not someone you should trust, or thank, or feel any kind of gratitude toward, because everything I touch turns to ash and pain and permanent damage that can never be repaired, no matter how much I wish I could take it all back and be normal, and not be this broken thing that destroys everyone who gets too close." She wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, frustrated by the display of weakness, frustrated by the way talking about her past made her feel like that 7-year-old child again, small and scared and completely powerless to stop the terrible gift that lived inside her from reaching out and destroying everything she loved. The silence that followed her confession felt heavier than the storm outside, felt like it was pressing down on her chest and making it hard to breathe, and Celine turned back to her stew with shaking hands, trying to focus on the simple task of preparing food, trying to ground herself in the familiar routine of survival rather than drowning in memories that threatened to pull her under completely. She didn't hear the shift in breathing patterns behind her, didn't notice the way the silver wolf's eyes opened slowly, consciousness returning with a clarity that suggested he'd been awake for far longer than she realized. Didn't sense the way all 12 of the other wolves were also stirring now, their exhaustion finally giving way to awareness and the kind of alertness that came from years of training and discipline and the ability to wake fully ready for action even after near-death experiences. The sound of bones cracking and reforming made Celine spin around so fast she nearly dropped her wooden spoon, made her press back against the wall, with her heart suddenly racing and her breath coming in short panicked gasps, because she knew that sound, had heard it countless times in her childhood before her exile. Knew it meant the wolves were shifting back to human form, and that within seconds she would be trapped in a small cottage with 13 naked strangers who would have questions and demands and expectations she couldn't possibly meet. The transformations happened almost simultaneously, 13 wolves becoming 13 men in a symphony of sound and movement that made the small space feel even more cramped and dangerous and absolutely terrifying. And Celine kept her blindfolded face turned toward the wall, kept her hands pressed flat against the rough wood behind her, kept her breathing as steady as she could manage while her mind raced through possible scenarios and escape routes and the growing certainty that she'd made a terrible mistake by saving them, by letting them into her sanctuary, by allowing herself to care whether they lived or died. "Don't be afraid," a voice said, deep and rich and carrying an authority that made Celine's wolf respond with automatic submission, even though she fought against the instinct with everything she had. "We're not going to hurt you. We owe you our lives, and we're not the kind of wolves who repay kindness with violence or threats or anything except gratitude and respect." The voice was coming from the direction where the silver wolf had been lying, and Selena knew, without being told, that this was him. This was the one who'd made her skin tingle and her heart race, and her carefully controlled isolation feel suddenly insufficient and incomplete in ways she didn't want to examine too closely. "You could understand me," Celine said, her voice coming out smaller and more frightened than she wanted it to. "This whole time, everything I said, you heard all of it." It wasn't a question because she already knew the answer. Could hear the truth in the way his breathing had changed when she mentioned it. Could sense the confirmation in the quality of silence that filled the cottage, in the wake of her words. "Every word," the man confirmed, and there was something in his voice that made Selena's stomach drop, made her realize that he hadn't just heard her confession about her past. He'd heard everything she'd said about being cursed and dangerous and broken. Had heard her describe in detail exactly what her power could do, and what she'd done with it, and why she lived alone wearing a blindfold, like some kind of self-imposed punishment for crimes she'd committed before she was old enough to understand what she was doing. "My name is Theron Silvercrest. I'm the Alpha King of the Northern Realm, and I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because it's going to sound impossible, but it's the absolute truth, and everything that happens next depends on whether you're brave enough to believe me and trust me, and accept what fate has brought to your door in the middle of a blizzard." Selene felt her knees go weak, felt the blood drain from her face as the implications of his words hit her like a physical blow. Because if he was the Alpha King, then she'd just confessed her darkest secrets to the most powerful wolf in the entire Northern Territories, had just revealed exactly what kind of threat she posed to Pack's security and social order, had just given him every reason he needed to execute her, or imprison her, or take her gift and use it the way her father had wanted to use it all those years ago. "Please," she heard herself saying, her voice breaking on the word. "Please just leave. Just forget you ever found me. Just let me go back to being alone where I can't hurt anyone. I won't tell anyone you were here. I won't reveal anything about your guard, or your movements, or whatever mission you were on that brought you through these woods. I'll take that memory if you want. I'll erase every trace of this encounter from your mind, if that's what it takes to make you leave me alone." "I don't want you to erase anything," Theron said, and he was moving closer now. She could hear his footsteps crossing the wooden floor, could sense the heat of his body as he stopped just a few feet away from where she stood, pressed against the wall like a cornered animal. "I don't want to leave, and I definitely don't want to forget you. Because, Selene Ashwood, you are exactly who I've been searching for over the past 2 years. You are the memory keeper my mother prophesied about before she died. You are the woman with silver hair, like moonlight, who has the power to take away my greatest burden and heal what I thought was broken beyond all possibility of repair. And you are my mate, my true mate chosen by the moon goddess herself. And I didn't come to these woods by accident or coincidence. I came here deliberately looking for you because you're the only one who can help me." The world seemed to tilt sideways, seemed to shift on its axis in a way that made Selene feel like she was falling, even though her feet were still firmly planted on the floor. And she shook her head violently, backing away from Theron's voice, even though there was nowhere left to go. Even though the wall behind her was solid and unyielding and offered no escape from the impossible words he was speaking. "No," she said. "No, you don't understand. I can't be anyone's mate. I can't be near people. I'll destroy you the way I destroyed my family. I'll take your memories and your identity and everything that makes you who you are, and you'll wake up not knowing your own name or why you're standing in a cottage with a monster who stole your entire life." "You won't," Theron said with absolute certainty. "Because you're not a memory eraser, Selene. You're a memory healer, and there's a difference that no one ever taught you, a difference that changes everything about what you think you are, and what you're capable of, and what your future could look like if you're willing to trust me enough to let me show you the truth." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, more vulnerable, carrying a weight of pain that made Selene's healer heart respond despite her fear. 5 years ago, my younger sister and my parents were murdered by someone I trusted, someone I loved like a brother. And every night since then, I've seen their dead bodies in my dreams. I've heard my sister calling my name while she died. I've relived my failure to protect them over and over until I can barely function as a king or a leader or anything, except a broken man drowning in guilt and grief and memories that are slowly destroying me from the inside out. Celine felt tears burning behind her blindfold again, felt the familiar ache of recognizing her own pain reflected in someone else's story, felt the terrible pull of her healer instinct, urging her to help, even though helping meant risk and exposure and the possibility of causing more harm than good. "I can't help you," she whispered. "I can't control what I take or how much I erase. I could take that memory and every other memory you have. I could leave you an empty shell with no past and no identity and no understanding of who you were before I destroyed you." "Then I'll take that risk," Theron said, "because living with these memories is already destroying me. And at least if you erase everything, there will be an end to the pain. There will be peace in the nothing. But if you can do what my mother prophesied, if you can heal instead of erase, if you can take away the sharp edges of my trauma without taking away my sister entirely, then maybe I can finally be the king my people need. Maybe I can finally sleep without screaming. Maybe I can finally move forward instead of being trapped in the worst moment of my life for the rest of my existence." His voice dropped lower, became almost intimate despite the presence of 12 other men in the small cottage. "And maybe, if you let me, I can show you that you're not a monster or a curse or something that needs to hide from the world. Maybe I can help you see yourself the way I see you, as someone brave and strong and compassionate who saved 13 strangers without hesitation, even though you were terrified. As someone who deserves love and belonging and a life that's more than just survival in isolation." Before Celine could respond, before she could process the overwhelming flood of information and emotion and impossible hope that his words stirred in her chest, one of the other men spoke up, his voice respectful but urgent. "Your Majesty, the storm is getting worse. We're going to be trapped here for at least 3 more days, possibly longer, and we should send word to the palace that we're safe before the council assumes we're dead and starts the succession trials." The practical words broke the spell of the moment, reminded Celine that this wasn't just her and Theron working through impossible revelations. This was a cottage full of witnesses and guards and people who would report back to a kingdom about the strange blindfolded Omega who lived alone in the forgotten woods with a power that could destroy minds and memories and everything that made a person themselves. "We're not sending word," Theron said, his tone making it clear this was a command, not a suggestion. "Because I don't want anyone knowing we found her until I'm certain she's safe, until I'm certain she understands that I'm not here to use her or threaten her or force her to do anything against her will." He turned his attention back to Celine, and even though she couldn't see him through her blindfold, she could feel the weight of his gaze, could sense the intensity of his focus. "I'm asking you, not ordering you, to help me, to try your gift one more time, but this time with intention to heal rather than destroy, with the understanding that if it works, you'll have discovered something incredible about yourself. And if it fails, then at least you tried, and at least I got to meet my mate before I lost everything. But either way, this is your choice, Celine, and I'll respect whatever you decide, even if that decision breaks both our hearts." The silence that followed was so complete that Celine could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could hear the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind and the breathing of 14 people all waiting for her response, all hanging on her next words, all depending on what she chose to do next, and the weight of that responsibility felt like it might crush her completely, might drive her to her knees under the impossible burden of deciding between the safety of isolation she'd built over 8 years and the terrifying possibility of hope and healing and a future she'd never dared to imagine might be possible for someone as broken and cursed as she believed herself to be. And as she stood there paralyzed by fear and temptation and the growing awareness that refusing Theron's request would haunt her for the rest of her life, because she'd never know if he was right about her gift, never know if she could have healed instead of destroyed, never know if the mate bond pulling at her heart was real or just another illusion born of loneliness and desperation, the cottage door suddenly exploded inward with a violence that sent splinters of wood flying across the room, and through the opening came a figure that made every wolf in the cottage shift into defensive positions, made Theron move to stand between Selene and the threat, made her blood run cold with recognition and terror, because the man standing in her doorway, covered in snow and radiating malicious intent, was her father, and he was smiling the same cruel smile he'd worn the last time she'd seen him 15 years ago. And his first words confirmed her worst nightmare and set in motion a confrontation that would force her to finally choose between the monster she believed herself to be and the healer Theron insisted she could become. "Hello, daughter," her father said, his voice carrying clearly over the storm. "I've been looking for you for 15 years, and now that I've finally found you, you're going to help me erase someone very important. Someone whose death has just become extremely valuable to people willing to pay any price to make the Alpha King forget he ever existed before they kill him properly. And you're going to do it willingly, or I'm going to make you watch while I erase that silver-haired boy's mind completely, the same way you erased your brothers, the same way you erased your mother's, because we both know you can't control your gift when you're emotional, and killing your mate while he watches helplessly should make you emotional enough to be very, very useful to me again." The world seemed to stop in that moment when Selene's father stepped through the shattered doorway, his presence filling her small cottage with a darkness that had nothing to do with the storm still raging outside, and everything to do with the memories that came flooding back with such intensity that she felt like she was 7 years old again, small and powerless, and trapped in a house where love had been twisted into something ugly and violent and utterly corrupting. She could feel Theron standing between her and her father like a living shield, could sense the way his 12 guards had shifted into defensive positions around the room, their bodies tense and ready for combat despite their recent injuries and exhaustion. And she knew with absolute certainty that if she didn't do something, if she didn't find some way to diffuse the situation before it exploded into violence, then people were going to die in her cottage. Blood was going to stain the floors she'd walked across blindfolded for 8 years, and the sanctuary she'd built for herself would become yet another place haunted by death and destruction and the consequences of her cursed existence. "You need to leave," Theron said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made alphas across the Northern Territories bow their heads in automatic submission. But Selene's father had never been the type to submit to anyone, had always believed that his cunning and manipulation and willingness to do terrible things made him more powerful than any amount of official rank or inherited authority. "You need to walk back out that door and disappear into the storm and forget you ever found this place, because I am Theron Silvercrest, Alpha King of the Northern Realm, and the woman you're threatening is under my protection. And if you think I'm going to let you touch her, or use her, or harm her in any way, then you've fundamentally misunderstood the situation you've walked into." The threat in his words was unmistakable, the promise of violence so clear that even someone without Selene's heightened senses would have felt the danger radiating from the Alpha King like heat from a forge. But her father just laughed, a sound so cold and cruel that it sent shivers down Selene's spine and made her wolf cower inside her chest. the way it used to cower when she was a child, and that laugh meant something terrible was about to happen. "You think your rank means anything to me?" her father said, moving deeper into the cottage with a confidence that suggested he wasn't alone, that he had backup waiting somewhere in the storm, that he'd planned this confrontation carefully and wasn't worried about the odds stacked against him. "You think I came here unprepared to deal with an Alpha King and his guards? I've been tracking my daughter for 15 years. I've spent more money than you can imagine building a network of informants and mercenaries and wolves who are loyal to gold rather than honor. And when I finally picked up her trail 3 days ago, I made sure to bring enough force to handle any complications that might arise, including the complication of you being here. Which is actually perfect, because the people who hired me want you dead anyway. And now I get to collect 2 fees instead of 1. The fee for killing you, and the fee for making you forget everything important before you die, so that your death will be even more tragic and meaningless." Celine felt her blood run cold as the implications of her father's words sank in, felt the terrible weight of understanding that she'd brought this danger to Theron's door by saving him, that her father had been following her trail and had found her at exactly the wrong moment, that the Alpha King who'd come looking for healing was about to be destroyed because she'd been selfish enough to let 13 wolves into her sanctuary instead of leaving them to freeze in the storm. "This is my fault," she heard herself saying, her voice breaking with guilt and self-recrimination, and the familiar certainty that everything she touched turned to disaster. "I should have left you outside, should have let you freeze, should have known that helping you would just bring more death and destruction, because that's all I ever do. That's all I'm good for. And now you're going to die because I was too weak to let you go, too lonely to resist the temptation of company, too broken to understand that some people are better off dead than saved by someone like me." "Stop," Theron commanded, and the word was directed at her, not her father, sharp and firm and carrying enough force that Celine actually flinched. "Stop blaming yourself for existing. Stop apologizing for having compassion. Stop acting like your gift is a curse instead of exactly what it's supposed to be. Because I've been listening to you tear yourself apart for 2 days now, and I'm done letting you believe the lies that your father and your old pack taught you." He shifted his stance slightly, keeping himself between Celine and her father, but angling his body so his voice would carry clearly to where she stood pressed against the wall. "You're not a monster. You're not a curse. And you're definitely not responsible for the choices that evil men make. And I'm about to prove it to you in a way that leaves no room for doubt or fear or any of the toxic beliefs that have been poisoning your mind since you were 7 years old." Before Celine could ask what he meant, before she could process the implications of his words or the sudden shift in the energy of the room, Theron turned back to her father and spoke with a calm certainty that was somehow more terrifying than any amount of rage or violence could have been. "You want to use Celine's gift to erase my memories before you kill me? You want to make me forget who I am, so that my death will be easier and cleaner and more profitable for whoever hired you. But here's what you don't understand about memory keepers. Here's what my mother spent years researching before she died. Here's the truth that Celine herself doesn't even know yet, because no one ever taught her, and she's been too afraid to experiment with the full scope of her abilities." He paused, letting the tension build, letting every wolf in the cottage lean forward slightly in anticipation of whatever revelation was coming. Memory keepers can't erase the memories of their true mates, can't touch the mind of the person the moon goddess chose for them, can't use their gift for harm or destruction when it comes to the one soul that's meant to be bound to theirs for eternity. And I know this because my mother's prophecy didn't just say I'd find a woman with silver hair who could heal my trauma. It said I'd find my mate whose gift would prove her identity, by being completely powerless against me, while being more powerful than ever against those who threatened us. The words hung in the air like a challenge and a promise and a revelation that changed everything Celine thought she understood about herself. And she felt her father's rage building across the room, felt the way his control slipped just enough to let his killing intent show through, felt the moment when he decided that words were pointless and violence was the only language that mattered anymore. "Then I'll just kill her," her father snarled, and Celine heard the sound of claws extending, heard him start to shift into his wolf form, heard Theron's guards moving to intercept him. But before any of them could act, before the cottage could erupt into the bloodbath that seemed inevitable, Celine did something she hadn't done in 8 years, something she'd sworn she would never do again, something that terrified her more than her father's threats or the possibility of death or any of the physical dangers that surrounded her in that moment. She reached up with trembling hands and pulled off her blindfold, letting it fall to the floor in a whisper of leather against wood. And she opened her eyes for the first time since the day she'd walked into exile. Opened them deliberately, and with full intention, and with the desperate hope that Theron was right about what she was, and what her gift could do, and what it meant that the moon goddess had chosen him as her mate. The world flooded into her vision in an overwhelming rush of color and shape and detail that made her gasp, made her stagger slightly as her brain struggled to process visual information after 8 years of voluntary darkness. And the first thing she saw clearly was Theron, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair that fell to his shoulders, and ice-blue eyes that held no fear as he met her gaze directly, deliberately, offering himself as proof of his theory about her gift and her nature, and the bond that connected them across fate and destiny, and the moon goddess's incomprehensible plans. Their eyes locked, and Celine felt her gift surge to life with an intensity she'd never experienced before. Felt the power flowing out of her in waves that should have been crashing into Theron's mind, should have been ripping through his memories and tearing apart everything that made him who he was. But instead, the power hit something, an invisible barrier that surrounded him like armor, and it bounced back toward her, transformed into something completely different, something warm and golden and healing rather than destructive. And she felt that transformed energy sink into her own mind and start working on her memories, start softening the sharp edges of her trauma, start wrapping her painful past in a protective layer that didn't erase anything but made it bearable, made it something she could live with instead of something that crushed her spirit every single day. "It's real," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she continued to stare at Theron, continued to test her gift against the mate bond that protected him completely, continued to feel the healing energy flowing back to her and transforming 8 years of guilt and self-hatred into something that felt almost like acceptance, almost like peace, almost like the beginning of forgiveness for sins she'd committed before she knew any better. "You're really my mate, and I can't hurt you, and my gift is healing me, and everything you said was true." "I told you," Theron said softly, his own eyes bright with emotion as he watched her see him for the first time, watched her discover the truth about herself through their connection, watched her begin to understand that she wasn't broken or cursed, but simply untrained and traumatized, and desperately in need of someone who could show her the difference between using her gift in fear versus using it in love. "I told you that you were exactly who I needed, exactly who the moon goddess meant for me to find. And now you know it's true because you can feel it working. You can feel your gift transforming from something destructive into something that heals. And if you're willing to trust me just a little bit more, If you're willing to take one more leap of faith, then I want you to turn that gift toward your father and show him what happens when a memory keeper finally understands her true nature and decides to protect instead of harm." Selena turned her gaze slowly toward where her father stood frozen in mid-shift, his body caught between human and wolf as he stared at her with an expression of shock and dawning horror, as he realized that his greatest weapon had just been turned against him, that the daughter he'd spent 15 years hunting had just discovered she was far more powerful than he'd ever imagined, that the curse he'd tried to exploit was actually a blessing he had no defense against. She looked at him directly, meeting his eyes with steady purpose, and she felt her gift flow out of her again. But this time, it was different. This time, she could sense the structure of his memories spread out before her, like a map she could read and understand and navigate with precision. This time, she could see exactly which memories were causing him pain and which were feeding his cruelty and which were the root causes of the monster he'd become. And instead of destroying everything the way she'd always done before, instead of erasing him completely and leaving an empty shell, she reached into his mind with surgical precision and found the specific memories that had twisted him, the traumas and fears and insecurities that had transformed a normal wolf into someone capable of using his own daughter as a weapon. And she didn't erase them, but she healed them, wrapped them in light and love and the kind of compassion that her grandmother had tried to teach her before everything fell apart. Her father's eyes went wide as he felt the change happening inside his mind, felt his memories shifting and transforming, felt the sharp edges of his pain being smoothed away, felt decades of accumulated bitterness and rage and desperate need for control being replaced by something softer, something that looked almost like peace. And when Celine finally released him from her gaze, he collapsed to his knees in the snow-covered doorway, his shift abandoned, his body shaking with sobs that seemed to be torn from somewhere deep inside his chest. "What did you do to me?" he asked, his voice broken and small, and nothing like the threatening growl he'd used moments before. "What did you take? Because I can remember everything, but it doesn't hurt anymore. It doesn't control me anymore, and I can see clearly for the first time in decades what I've done and what I've become, and how badly I've hurt the people I should have protected. And I'm so sorry, Celine. I'm so sorry for everything I did to you and your brother and your mother. I'm so sorry for turning your gift into a weapon instead of helping you understand it was meant to heal. I'm so sorry for being the monster who made you believe you were one too." Celine felt more tears sliding down her face as she listened to her father's confession, felt the complicated tangle of emotions that came with hearing the man who'd traumatized her for years finally taking responsibility for his actions, finally acknowledging the harm he'd caused, finally becoming someone who might be capable of change and growth and redemption if given the chance and the support and the kind of healing she'd just provided. "I didn't take anything," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears. "I healed the memories that were making you cruel. I softened the trauma that was driving you to hurt others. I gave you the gift that Theron helped me discover, the gift of being able to remember your past without being controlled by it, the gift of carrying your pain without letting it define you, the gift of finally being free from the worst parts of yourself so you can choose to be better moving forward." She took a shaking breath and added, "But healing your memories doesn't erase what you did. Doesn't mean you're forgiven for 15 years of hunting me, or for trying to use me as a weapon, or for threatening my mate. And you're going to have to face consequences for your actions and make amends for the harm you've caused, if you want any hope of redemption or peace, or a future that isn't defined by the monster you used to be. Theron moved to stand beside Celine, his hand finding hers and threading their fingers together in a gesture of support and solidarity, and the kind of partnership that spoke of equals rather than the traditional alpha-omega dominance dynamic. And when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a king, but also the warmth of a mate who'd just witnessed something extraordinary and wanted to honor it properly. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit regicide and for the abuse and attempted exploitation of a memory keeper, he said to Celine's father, his tone formal but not cruel, firm but not vindictive. You'll be taken back to the capital to face trial and sentencing, but I want you to understand that the mercy my mate just showed you is more than you deserved and more than I would have given you if the choice had been mine. And if you have any wisdom at all, you'll use this second chance she's granted you to become someone worthy of the healing she's provided. Someone who helps other wolves find the same peace and clarity and freedom from their worst impulses that you've just been given. The guards moved forward to secure Celine's father, their movements efficient, but not unnecessarily rough. And as they led him out into the storm, where apparently more of Theron's forces had been waiting, having tracked the Alpha King to the cottage and arrived just in time to capture the mercenaries her father had brought with him, Celine felt something inside her chest crack open and release. Felt 8 years of accumulated guilt and shame and self-hatred pour out of her like poison being drained from a wound. Felt the space that suffering had occupied being filled with something new and tentative and fragile, but undeniably real. I healed him, she said wonderingly, turning to look at Theron with eyes that were still adjusting to seeing the world again, but that could see him clearly enough to make her heart skip beats. I healed my father's memories without erasing who he was. I used my gift to help instead of harm. I did exactly what you said I could do, and it worked. It actually worked. And that means everything I believed about myself for the past 17 years was wrong. Means I've been hiding and suffering and punishing myself for being something I'm not. Means I could have been helping people all this time instead of running away from them. You didn't know, Theron said gently, pulling her closer and wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that felt like coming home, like finding safety after a lifetime of danger, like finally being seen and valued and cherished for exactly who she was rather than being feared or exploited or rejected. No one taught you the truth about your gift. No one showed you how to use it with intention and control. No one explained that memory keepers are meant to be healers, not weapons, and you've spent your entire life being traumatized and manipulated by people who should have protected you. So please don't blame yourself for not understanding something you had no way of knowing. Please don't feel guilty for surviving the only way you knew how. Please don't waste another second hating yourself for being exactly who the moon goddess made you to be. Because you're perfect, Celine. You're absolutely perfect just as you are, and I'm going to spend the rest of our lives proving it to you every single day until you finally believe it yourself. The days that followed were a blur of revelation and transformation and slow healing as the storm finally cleared, and Theron's guards secured the area and arrangements were made for the journey back to the capital. And through it all, Celine kept her blindfold off, kept her eyes open and active, and learning to see the world again, while also learning to control her gift with precision and intention under Theron's patient guidance and encouragement. She practiced on the guards with their full consent, healing old battle traumas and softening painful memories until each of them looked at her with gratitude and respect and the kind of loyalty that wasn't commanded, but freely given to someone who'd proven themselves worthy of devotion. And she discovered that her gift responded to love and compassion in ways it had never responded to fear and desperation. that when she approached memories with the intention to heal rather than destroy, the power flowed smoothly and precisely, and left only peace and clarity in its wake. When Theron finally asked her to attempt the healing he'd originally sought, when he sat across from her in her cottage on the last night before they left for the capital and offered her access to his most painful memories, Selene approached the task with reverence and care and the absolute certainty that she could help him without harming him, that her gift was finally being used for exactly what it was meant to do. She looked into his ice-blue eyes and felt the mate bond flare between them like silver fire. Felt her power flow through that connection straight into his mind. And she found the memory of his sister's death wrapped in layers of trauma and guilt and grief so thick they'd nearly suffocated everything good and joyful in his personality. And instead of taking that memory away, instead of erasing Lyanna from his mind completely, she carefully unwrapped the trauma and replaced it with love, showed him his sister's smile and her laughter and all the beautiful moments they'd shared together, transformed the sharp edges of his loss into something he could carry without being destroyed by it, gave him back his sister not as a source of endless pain, but as a treasured memory that could finally bring comfort instead of agony. When she released him from her gaze, Theron was crying, tears streaming down his face as he experienced the change, as he felt the weight that had been crushing him for 5 years finally lift and allow him to breathe freely for the first time since the night his family died. And he pulled Selene into his arms and held her like she was the most precious thing in the entire world. Like she was the answer to prayers he'd stopped believing would ever be answered. Like she was exactly what he'd been searching for through 2 years of following prophecies and investigating rumors and refusing to give up hope that somewhere his mate was waiting to be found. "Thank you," he whispered into her silver hair, his voice rough with emotion and gratitude and love so deep it made Selene's wolf howl with joy inside her chest. "Thank you for being brave enough to try. Thank you for trusting me enough to believe. Thank you for being exactly who you are, because you've given me my life back. You've given me my sister back in a way I never thought possible. You've given me hope and healing and a future I can actually look forward to instead of dreading. And I'm going to spend the rest of our lives making sure you never doubt your worth or your gift or your place at my side as my mate and my Luna and my equal partner in everything." The journey to the capital took 2 weeks through snow-covered forests and frozen valleys and mountain passes that tested their endurance, but also gave Selene time to adjust to the reality of her new life. Time to process the enormity of the changes that had happened in less than a week. Time to slowly accept that she was leaving her cottage and her isolation behind permanently and stepping into a future that included a mate who loved her, a kingdom that would need her healing gifts, a purpose that went far beyond simple survival, and a chance to finally be the person she was meant to be, instead of the monster she'd believed herself to be for so long. The pack members they encountered along the way responded to her with curiosity rather than fear, with respect rather than rejection. And Theron made sure everyone understood that she was under his protection, and that anyone who showed her anything except honor and courtesy would answer to him personally. And slowly, carefully, Selene began to believe that maybe she could have this. Maybe she could belong somewhere. Maybe she deserved the happiness that was being offered to her if she was brave enough to reach out and claim it. The mating ceremony was held under the full moon 3 months after they arrived at the capital. 3 months that Selene spent learning to be a Luna, studying the kingdom's history and politics and needs, establishing a healing sanctuary where wolves suffering from trauma could come to find peace and clarity and freedom from the memories that haunted them, and falling deeper in love with Theron every single day as he proved over and over that he meant every promise he'd made to her in that tiny cottage during the blizzard. She wore a dress of silver silk that matched her hair and caught the moonlight until she seemed to glow like something otherworldly and magical. And when Theron marked her before the entire kingdom, when his teeth sank into her neck and claimed her as his mate and Luna and queen, the bond between them completed with such intensity that witnesses later swore they saw silver light explode outward from the couple like a star being born. Like the moon goddess herself was blessing the union, like something profound and important and destined had finally clicked into place exactly as it was meant to. Years later, when Selene would stand in her healing sanctuary and counsel young Omegas who felt broken or cursed or unworthy of love, when she would look into their eyes and gently heal the trauma that made them hate themselves, when she would share her story about living blindfolded for 8 years because she was too afraid of her own power to dare look at the world, she would always end with the same truth that had transformed her life and could transform theirs if they were willing to believe it. I thought my gift was a curse that made me a monster, she would tell them, her hand in Theron's as he stood beside her the way he always did. Partners in everything, equals in love and respect and devotion. I thought I was too broken to be loved, too dangerous to deserve happiness, too damaged to have any purpose except hiding from the world and waiting to die. But I was wrong about all of it, wrong about my gift, and wrong about myself, and wrong about what was possible. Because the truth is that the things we fear most about ourselves are often exactly the gifts the world needs most desperately. The wounds we carry are often the source of our greatest strength and compassion. And the person who seems most impossible to love, most certain to be rejected, most convinced they're a monster, is often exactly the person someone is desperately searching for. Someone who will see past the fear and the trauma and the protective walls to the beautiful soul underneath that's been waiting its whole life to finally be seen and chosen and cherished. She would watch the hope dawn in their eyes the way it had dawned in hers, would see them begin to believe that maybe their story could have a happy ending too, that maybe their curse was actually a blessing waiting to be understood, that maybe somewhere their mate was looking for them and would recognize them not despite their brokenness, but because of it, because their wounds matched in ways that allowed healing to flow between them, because the moon goddess knew exactly what she was doing when she created souls that could only be completed by finding each other across distance and time and the kind of pain that seemed insurmountable until love proved it wrong. And Selene would know with absolute certainty that every terrible thing she'd endured, every year of isolation and guilt and self-hatred, every moment of suffering and fear and crushing loneliness had been worth it because it led her to this moment, to this life, to this purpose, to this love that had transformed her from a woman who couldn't look at the world into a queen who could heal it one memory at a time, one traumatized soul at a time, one act of compassion and understanding at a time. And she would thank the moon goddess silently for the gift of Theron, for the gift of her power finally understood and properly used, for the gift of 13 wolves collapsing in a blizzard at exactly the right moment to change everything, and most of all, for the gift of finally understanding that she'd never been a monster at all. She'd only been a healer who hadn't yet learned that the same power that could destroy when used in fear could save everything when used in love. If you enjoyed this story of Selene and Theron, of a blindfolded Omega who discovered her curse was actually the greatest gift imaginable. Of an alpha king who saw potential where others only saw danger, of healing and hope, and the transformative power of love that sees past trauma to the beautiful soul underneath. Please take a moment to subscribe to this channel so you never miss another tale of werewolves and fated mates and the kind of romance that changes everything. Leave a comment below telling me what you thought of Celine's journey from isolation to becoming a beloved queen. What moment resonated most deeply with you? Whether you believed in the possibility of her redemption, and what kind of werewolf stories you'd like to see next. Because your engagement and enthusiasm and support are what make creating these stories possible and worthwhile and deeply meaningful to me as a storyteller. Hit the notification bell so you'll be alerted the moment the next story drops. Share this with anyone who loves alpha kings and powerful omegas and romances that prove broken people can heal each other when they're brave enough to trust. And know that every like and comment and subscription helps me continue bringing you tales of fated mates and second chances, and the beautiful truth that sometimes the things we fear most about ourselves are exactly what the right person has been searching for their entire life. Thank you so much for reading, for investing your time and emotion in Celine and Theron's story. And I'll see you in the next tale, where new characters will discover that the moon goddess always knows exactly what she's doing, even when her plans seem impossible or painful or completely incomprehensible. Because love has a way of making sense of even the most complicated and broken and seemingly hopeless situations if we're willing to be brave enough to believe in its power to transform everything.